Every major police scandal ends the same way. The incident happens, you see the outrage, and then comes the sentence. Once these context disappears, these narratives come in, and it replaces evidence, real evidence. And once that narrative wins, especially out in the media, policing becomes theater. It's not about safety anymore.
Well, nobody is concerned in asking, why were these people running from the police? What were they doing? The question they ask now is, why was the cop chasing them? Then they judge the cop for what his decision was in chasing the person. And we're even seeing that cops are starting to be prosecuted for that.
The sentence doesn't just accuse the officer, it accuses the entire system.
You have supervisors, leaders, prosecutors, and judges that want the law to be what they want the outcome to be, as opposed to what it actually is.
Some officer who did nothing wrong would be destroyed by the exposure.
No one's concerned with the criminal. The criminal gets a free pass.
Hill of Justice is sponsored and produced by Jermaine Delmas Studios.
Every major police scandal ends the same way. The incident happens, you see the outrage, and then comes the sentence that changes everything. The officer had prior complaints. The sentence doesn't just accuse the officer, it accuses the entire system. And here's the contradiction that should bother you. Some officers who should have been exposed weren't. Some officers who did nothing wrong would be destroyed by the exposure. What we're going to do is dissect the systems, because the transparency can either have and save policing or collapse it from within. I'm Jerome Hill, former police officer and state investigator, and with me is retired Sheriff Victor Hill. Take a moment to check if you're subscribed to the channel. Many think that they are, and this helps support the channel. And subscribe, like, and comment. It costs you no money at all. When the public says discipline history should be public, I think that they're really asking for honesty, but they're really not. They're asking a classic investigative question. Is there a pattern of abuse? And this is all about inductive reasoning. I do a lot. We examine repeated behavior to infer risk. And the inductive reasoning is powerful, but it can also be dangerous, particularly when it's misunderstood. So let me tell you something as a former state investigator. If you pulled any veterans cop's internal file and released it raw, you'll swear half the department was corrupt. And that assumption would be false. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you're right, Jerome. It's absolutely a two-edged sword. Here's the problem with it. Okay, even if you have 5 valid complaints, the complaint that's being investigated, that's getting all the attention, may not be valid. So do you convict this person based on the 5 prior complaints? So that's one thing you got to look at. You also got to look at the fact that a lot of people will load up an officer's files with complaints just to do it. Let me give you an example. A person gets a ticket. He doesn't agree with the ticket. So I'm going to file a complaint because that's his way of getting back at the officer. It's, in some ways, it's a way of harassing cops and stuff like that. It's a fact. Now, here's the thing. You got to take all the complaints because sometimes they're valid. And you know, it's a very thin line, and what you got to hope for is that the people in charge are going to look at the facts and be fair and unbiased, and that the lies are not going to prevail the truth. So it's a very, very delicate situation, because you can't just hear a complaint and say, oh, that sounds like some BS, I'm not going to investigate it, because it may not be. I know I've received some complaints at the jail when I was sheriff that sounded far out, but I say, hey, look into it just in case it was true. And I can think of 2 incidents where, as far out as it sounds, when they pulled the cameras or when they actually looked into it, it actually happened.
Mm.
And so you've got to look into all complaints, but you got to also look at the fact that an officer can have a complaint made against him. He can have a supervisor that doesn't like him, and they can side with the complainant and fill up his file with stuff that's really invalid or whatever, and then it looks like, oh wow, we've got 15 or 20 complaints. You know, Jerome, I know you know back when we were cops, they used to always say, well, if you're not getting complaints, you're not doing your job. And the reason they would
Yeah, I
say
want to
that,
talk about that. Right.
exactly, and the reason they would say that is because if cops were out there actively enforcing the law, it's virtually impossible to go out there and enforce the law without a complaint because somebody's not going to like it. So there's a delicate balance, and you got to hope that there's someone in charge or someone that sits in judgment that's going to be fair to both sides, both the person making the complaint and the person being complained on. You don't want a situation like what you see we have a lot in the judicial system now, where it's not necessarily about who's guilty or who's innocent, but it's about who's being prosecuted or who we want to see prosecuted. And do we want to see this person prosecuted as opposed to do we want to see the law actually enforced? And that's where it
Right.
gets murky. Let me say this because I know you want to get in. If you look at the law or the system, let's start with our judicial system, then go to our policy system. The judicial system on paper is one of the best and the plainest. It's not the law is not the problem. Most of the law, most of it, there's a lot that's ambiguous, but most of it is plain and simple. The problem is not the system on paper. The problem is the people who administer it and their bias and what they're trying to do. So that's why you see so many conflicting rulings. You'll see the courts rule one way on the same issue and rule differently on the same issue. You get these conflicting rulings because they're ruling based on some maybe personal bias or who's the person that's actually being prosecuted.
Right.
Well, when you go down to the lower level in different agencies and look at policies, whoever you have sitting on these review boards or whatever like that, you can get a lot of the same. If there was a way to take the politics out of it and it simply be about what the policy says and is the person in violation of the policy or not, then it would be more clear cut. But because of the fact that politics and people get involved, that's where the system gets misconstrued. And then the same rule that applies to you doesn't apply to me or vice versa.
Right. And, when I take a look at this methodically, we're talking about discipline files. They're not criminal rap sheets. The discipline files also have what? Late reports. They have missed court appearances, rudeness complaints. You got policy misunderstandings. You talked about a little bit false allegations. We're talking about, emotional responses after violent calls. So most of these complaints, and I want to go ahead and let everybody know how they're really broken down. These complaints are broken down like unfounded, unprovable, in what we call substantiated, unsubstantiated. And these are some of these that are emotionally driven, much a little bit what you were talking about, and publishing those is not transparency as much because you got to take the context and remove that. And this is where people confuse visibility with truth.
You know,
Visibility without explanation doesn't inform the public.
I think we're asking too much of our law enforcement, and I don't want to say we because it's not us, but it's all these folks talking about transparent. Most of the people talking about transparent aren't transparent at all. They're some of the folks that's trying to conceal stuff. Transparency has really become a political term, and transparency means we want to know something about you, but we're not going to tell you about us. At the end of the day, most of these people doing that. But let me tell you what the real problem with this is. Are we going to make everybody's personnel record public, whether they work at Coca Cola, whether they work at whatever, or is it only police officers? You got to think about that. Because if you can go into anybody's file and probably find any type of complaint anywhere, you should be able to find a complaint on someone working at McDonald's if they're rude. But everybody wants to hold law enforcement officers to the so-called higher standard, and which I think is ridiculous. I think everybody should be held to the same standard, which is fear, because trying to hold someone to a higher standard because they hold a particular position, they should be held to the same standard of fairness and politeness within reason. But let me give you an example of how dangerous this can be. If you go into my personnel jacket at the Clayton County Police Department back when I was a homicide detective, if it's still there, there should be a complaint about me being rude. I'm a homicide detective. There was a robbery in the area. I went to this. I would go door to door to barbershops and beauty parlors and take pictures of the person or drawings of it to see if they seen the person can help me find it. So it's kind of like a door to door canvas in a way, but it's only with businesses. Get to this one door, it's locked. So I knock on the door. There's a lady sitting there. I show her the badge. She lets me in. So what I thought was a joking conversation turned into something rude. The lady was like, "Hey, I didn't know you were a cop until you showed the badge, and I didn't know who you were looking for." And I just cracked a joke. I said, "I was looking for you. I thought you was on the top 10 most wanted." Everybody laughed. I thought she laughed too. And so I said, "No, seriously, this is what I'm here for." Well, the next day she goes and filed a complaint and said she was insulted by a joke. When they interviewed everybody else, they were like, "Hey, we just took it lighthearted. We didn't know her feelings was hurt." Well, if you look in my file, you would probably think I was being rude and harassing a person.
Right.
What prompted her
Right.
to do that? I don't know. Was her feelings hurt for real? I don't know. Or did she just want to do it? Don't ask me. I don't know. But
Right. Right.
if you look at that, then somebody could take that and say, "See, there was a complaint back then, and there was a citizen that felt he was rude." And then you take it and you blow it out of proportion. Now, that complaint lasted longer than it should have because I had a supervisor that didn't care for me. So he went up and down trying to find something in it, and of course it was unfounded because all of the witnesses said we didn't. We thought everybody was joking and having a good time,
Right.
and
Right.
we
It-
appreciated him coming and checking and letting us know it's in the neighborhood and see if we saw anything. So if you want to look at that, you want to make all of that public, and then let somebody twist it, which people are known to do, and make it something that it's not. And you're going to do that for every cop out there, and you're going to create a situation that just doesn't make any sense at all. I can see if this cop gets charged with a crime or there's something going to court, and okay, we need to look in his particular file to see if there's anything germane to that. They have done that. They're going to do that, and they're going to do that to the end of time. But just to make everybody's personnel file available, if we're not going to do it for everyone that holds a job, I don't think it's fair to do it to law enforcement.
I think part of it is, I've been sued and over $106 million for excessive force in my career. And I try to use this analogy with people and ER doctors. They get sued more than family doctors. Do you know why?
Why?
It's not because of skill. It's because of exposure. The
Mm-hmm.
same applies to us as cops. The ones making the most arrests, handling the most volatile calls, working the worst neighborhoods, they generate the most complaints.
Is it true?
And if you don't normalize that data, you don't get that type of accountability. You get this distortion and distraction. And this is part of the problem. Now, if we shifted this and we start going into deductive reasoning, if an officer has a sustained finding, not allegations, and they were talking about excessive force, dishonesty, civil rights violations, sexual misconduct, corruption, then disclosure isn't optional no more. It's required. And,
Absolutely.
and why is that? Because the credibility is the backbone of the justice system. And courts already recognize this in these obligations. And so we got to go ahead and have some fidelity to that. Now, if we take a look at departments like the New York City Police Department, they didn't lose trust. If you remember all those misconduct allegations and those sustained allegations up there quite some time ago, it was because they lost the trust because of transparency, something we were talking about. They lost the trust because all these patterns were ignored that people were talking about and complaining about forever. If you remember, I mean, up to the point where they had a broomstick and they sodomized, a young man. This is what was going on, and it damaged the public perception of NYPD. So the issue isn't whether to disclose, it's what and how. And I think that's a little bit what we're talking about. What do we disclose and how do we disclose it?
Yeah, I agree. There's a difference between investigating something and covering something up. There's a big difference. And one of the hardest things that I had to teach my supervisors, there's this culture that happens in police work where it says that, you got to look out for your people. And,
Mhm.
and that is true. But looking out for them doesn't mean covering up wrongdoing. Looking out for them means okay, if they get behind in their rent, maybe we can help them out.
Right.
If they can't work a shift, maybe we can work the shift for them. But if there's an actual wrongdoing that's going on and you cover it up, that's not looking out for your people.
Right.
So I agree with you. If there is something that happened and it's sustained and it's in that line of what this person is doing now, then that should be made available. But the question is, if it was sustained, why is that person still there? Because if something was sustained that ended up getting to something of a particular magnitude like that, then you're talking about negligent retention, meaning that there
Mhm.
were some things that were sustained, but this person was retained regardless. That brings up a interesting analogy. um, I terminated a lot of people when I was the sheriff, and of course, you know, and I've given the analogy. I probably terminated more people than was terminated on the Apprentice. And interestingly, and we covered some of this on one of our shows, a lot of
Mhm.
people that I terminated were rehired back because I guess there was this perception, oh, you were fired by the big bad wolf. Come on back. He's too hard or whatever. And interestingly, if you look at the folks I fired, one guy I fired is a jail commander of the Clayton County Jail. We did a story on the Clayton County Jail. Now it's probably the worst jail in the nation. 7 murders, gang rapes, drugs, extortions, escapes, everything. So a person I fired is now the jail commander. So think about that. We did a story about the DeKalb County Jail and how 3 inmates uh, repelled out of the 18th, not the 18th, I'm sorry, the 8th story, which is really the 16th story because it's two double. Well,
Mhm.
the assistant jail commander is a guy that I fired. Something just came out about Clayton County and an officer being involved in a drug transaction. That was someone that I fired that someone brought back. So when you talk about transparency, when these guys were involved in these type of things, I think it should be known that hey, these are people who were terminated and brought back. You're talking about that makes sense. But if you're talking about every time somebody makes a complaint, well, he pulled me over on a traffic stop and he gave me a ticket and he was rude or he didn't listen to me. A lot of that stuff boils down to perception.
Mhm.
And we just want to make sure that if it's that when you do put this type of stuff out, it's germane to what the situation is.
Right.
But it
Right.
needs to be germane in a way that's serious, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I wanted to kill another myth. Internal affairs is not a complaint box. You know, it is actually a formal investigative process. It's really modeled after the federal standards used by the FBI, and these are for cases that are need to be documented, corroborated, and sustained or unfounded. And when you're releasing some of these unfounded complaints publicly, at least, it's equivalent to charging someone after a not guilty verdict. And
Right,
that's where we have some of these problems. No justice system does that actually,
right,
except policing. And that's the politics that you were talking about.
exactly.
And it gets involved in this whole hyperbolic, disgusting film of slander to officers. It doesn't help the public at all.
Right. And the slander is just at a whole nother level. We could do a whole nother show on that.
Mhm.
Anytime. I caught somebody lying, it was automatic termination. Let me tell you why. There's only two reasons why people get false charges put on them. When you look at all of these cases where people were sent to prison for stuff they didn't do, it can only be for two reasons. That means that somebody planted evidence or they committed perjury against them.
Mm.
Right. That's how you got people that end up going to prison. Unfortunately, DNA has uncovered that. I mean, unfortunately, 20 and 30 years later in a lot of cases. But there are a lot of cases that has nothing to do with DNA, and people are convicted based on lies. Ask me how I know. So when you're dealing with situations like that, that's why you got to be very, very. You got to really look at these allegations, and not just police and citizen. There are people who file false reports to get other people arrested.
Yeah.
Part of the reason why a lot of rape victims have been victimized twice. And when I say victimized twice, meaning not just victimized by the person that raped them, but not necessarily treated well by law enforcement, which there's no excuse for. But there's a reason. When you notice as well, you come on as a rookie cop and they teach you, okay, the old cops will tell you, 90% of rape complaints are BS is what they tell you. They tell all the rookies
Mhm.
that. Well, the reason they say that is there's just a lot of situations that you go on where a person may get caught cheating, a person may be involved in some type of transaction, and then when it doesn't go the way they want it to go, or they get caught, well, then the most convenient thing to do is to say rape. Okay, so you got to be very, very careful with that because you're talking about rape in Georgia is 20 years and can lead up to the death penalty. So it's not the type of thing that you just want to throw out there or whatever. So a cop needs to really know that this is what's going on. Well, then when you get people who are being raped for real, now they're being looked at with scrutiny because you've had so many people who've come in and lied. So that's why when you look into all of these cases, not just citizen to police, but even citizen to citizen, unfortunately, there's so many people out there willing to lie. You got to make sure that what they're saying is true because you don't want to put an innocent person in jail. But then at the same time, you don't want to victimize a victim and think they're lying when they're telling the truth.
Right.
So
You
that
you do
it's
got
it's
that.
it's a very hard situation. Then when you put people in there who don't care about the truth, they just want to get an arrest or a conviction. That's when it complicates it, and that's how we get so many innocent people in jail, or that's how we get people with complaints sustained that should not be sustained. What
Right.
we
Right.
what we got to get to, Jerome, is this: the policy says what the policy says, the law says what the law says, but you have supervisors, leaders, prosecutors, and judges that want the law to be what they want the outcome to be, as opposed to what it actually is. And you see this a lot in use of force cases. The policy trains officers to do something. The law says they can do it. And then when they do it, if there's a public perception of, well, he didn't have to do that, now all of a sudden we want to charge these officers with aggravated assault and murder or whatever like that. Well, if you're going to train a person to do something, if you're going to put in policy they can do it, and then suddenly decide, well, we don't agree with it. That's not what the law or the policy says. And if you
Right.
if you stick by that, then these complaints should be more accurately investigated. The officer either violated policy or he didn't. It's kind of
And
like that
it
scenario I gave. I either violated policy by cracking a joke or not, and I didn't.
right.
But there was
Right.
a
Right.
supervisor actively trying to make it into something it wasn't. But it was just too many witnesses that they didn't even understand why he was there investigating because they said, "Yeah, he cracked a joke. What's the problem?" You see what I'm saying?
Right. And that's what I call institutional panic. You
Right,
have to have leadership to go ahead and handle that because then you're getting into things of politics, but more importantly, selective transparency. And, when we take a look at these departments and they release records, let's talk about only after the riots, or they
right,
leak selectively They dump raw data without any explanation for what it is. That's not openness. You're not giving it the proper context it needs. And what that causes, it causes officers to stop self-reporting.
Yes.
You get supervisors, they stop documenting things. And so the early warning systems, those systems collapse. And you don't fix a system by making honesty dangerous at all. You shouldn't be doing that. And so, I think that what is also worth saying is most cops want bad cops gone. They don't want reckless partners. I know I didn't. They don't want tainted cases either. That hurts them. And they don't want the badge to be poisoned in any type of way. But they also understand this truth. Once these context disappears, these narratives come in and it replaces evidence, real evidence. And once that narrative wins, especially out in the media, policing becomes theater. It's not about safety anymore.
No, it's not. No, it's not. And it's sad because the people who are behind this stuff, they think they're doing something, but ultimately they're putting everybody's lives and families in danger, and they don't realize it, including their own. And they won't realize it until something happens to them. Because when you constantly do that to cops, you train them how to do something. You tell them, okay, you can do this in this particular situation. Then when they do it, if the media spins it a certain way or some community activist spins it a certain way, well, now you got a DA trying to indict them or whatever like that. Well, why would officers even want to do their job at that point? And
Right.
like you and I was discussing earlier in another case offline, it's now to the point to where everybody is looking at the officer. Let's give a good example: a high-speed chase. Officers are chasing a person. That person hits a car and kills somebody, which is a very sad, unfortunate. Well, nobody is concerned in asking why were these people running from the police? What were they doing? The question they ask now is, why was the cop chasing him? Then
Mhm.
they judge the cop for what his decision was in chasing the person, and we're even seeing that cops are starting to be prosecuted for that. No one's concerned with the criminal. The criminal gets a free pass. Um, the deep pockets that wants money, and I'm not saying the family doesn't deserve money in a situation like that, but they're not looking at the criminals. They're looking at the police and the police department. We're going to sue you to get the money. The media and the prosecutors, we're going to prosecute this cop. And the guy who was committing a crime and putting the public's life in danger, because that's what he's doing. Hey, I'm committing a crime, and it's so important to me to get away that I'm gonna aim this 2,000 bullet at the public with no regard for anyone's safety. No one's thinking about charging him with attempted murder on the public, but they're thinking
Mhm.
about charging the cop, and they're thinking about suing the agency and the cop, and that's where society has got twisted at. And
Right.
the
Right.
criminals are getting a free pass, and it almost reminds you back to when they first lost control of the schools. And there's this thing, well, we don't care what they did. They're a child. Okay, you don't care what they did. So you want to fire the teacher, you want to lock up the teacher, and now you wonder why kids are spitting, kicking, jumping, doing
Mhm.
all type of things to teacher. And God forbid if that teacher takes action, then they become the focus, not the
It gets
so-called child
right.
that does it.
Right.
Well, that's what we've done with criminals now. The
Yeah.
criminals are no longer the problem. It's that same thing. We don't care what they did. That cop, okay, you don't care what they did. They was just robbing someone. They was cutting tails off puppies or whatever, and you don't care what they did. You're more concerned with going after the cops. And then
Yeah.
we wonder why the crime is high, and we wonder why criminals have so much control, because you have these so-called woke people who are really, they need to wake up. They got to still be asleep to think like that, where they're more interested in protecting the rights of the criminals than the citizens, or the people who are protecting the citizens from them. And that's how we end
Yeah.
up in this grand mess we're in now.
And I was just thinking about that. I would joke with suspects and criminals alike, saying that hey, I'm just want to let you know you got more rights than I do, and I was being dead serious about that. And one of the things that we need to, if there's going to be a disclosure of some type. They have to be sustained serious misconduct for sure. Final outcomes to investigations, that were serious. And clear explanations of those, and what should be protected, that should never go out, is unfounded complaints, you know, administrative issues that are minor, that wouldn't even amount to anything, and you should never, ever, if it's protected, an active investigation. I mean, that's cop 101, right? And
I
so
agree. Let me tell
can't
you,
do that.
in here it was a standard procedure. I didn't do it, but there were some agencies that thought it was a good idea. Well, anytime there's officer involved shooting, we're going to release the name of the officer. For what?
Hmm.
For
Right.
what? So his family can get threats, so people can look him up, so they can do whatever. Okay, I'm not telling you that every shooting involved with officers is a good one. And when it is something egregious, like what we saw in North Charleston a few years ago, when a guy that just took off running was shot in the back, or something egregious like that, of course it needs to be dealt with. But
Right.
when you take every single shooting and automatically convict the officer over any technicality, and then expose him and his family to that type of risk, then you expect everyone to go out and still protect us.
Right.
They can't even protect themselves.
And now the question nobody wants to answer: if discipline histories are public, who audits the investigators writing those findings? We've talked a little bit about that. Because if those investigators are biased, political, or untrained, what we were just talking about,
Which a
then
lot of them are.
transparency, right? Then transparency doesn't expose corruption; it manufactures it. And I think that's how we'll leave
Absolutely,
this show. And
absolutely.
that's where we are
And
about that.
that's exactly where we are. And that goes into
Mhm.
all types of subjects, grand juries, and everything else.
Correct. Right. So once again, if you like the show, once again, go ahead and comment, like, subscribe. And we really appreciate when we're ascending, and it's all because of you. You guys are the true heroes out here. And until later, we'll talk to you.